The 5th byte of October will be our portal into new worlds. I mean, games in general are kind of like portals into new worlds, but we literally want to learn how to use a warp tile to warp to different places on our map.
Today, we are going to start with something incredibly easy, and then we're going to move into one of the most requested features that I get of why doesn't this work, or how can I? We're going to learn how to add a warp to a screen, and by default, NESmaker has one byte that is reserved for a screen to let you go into like a door and go to somewhere else on a given map. But a lot of people ask, okay, well, how can I set up like two different doors? And there are complications involved with this. We could get a lot further, but we're only going to have a certain amount of time. I don't want to go too long with this video, but I will show you how to make two different warps that can lead you to two different directions. Another case of coming back through those doors and showing up back on the same screen, but we can use a very similar method for that as well, if you're very smart and can cleverly think outside the box. So we're going to look at how we can add multiple warps for a screen. And so let's say you wanted to do a screen where you could either go to level 1 or go to warp zone for level 1 or warp zone to level 2. We could do that. I don't want to use the monster screen that I already set up. In fact, I'm going to delete that. So I'm going to go to my overworld. And if I want to delete a screen, I can go to my map. I can just right click and hit delete screen. It'll ask if I want to delete for sure. I say yes, and it's gone. So I'm going to create a new screen that's going to have my warps on it. And I'm going to do the same thing where I just really quickly put the ground in there. Oops. And I use my 7 key to paint the ground underneath there. And I'm not really worried about anything that's in the HUD because it's going to get overwritten anyway, but just in case. Now I'm going to make these solid. Use the 0 key to paint my solid collisions. All this is very familiar. All this you guys have plenty of experience with so far. I'm not going to put my monsters in here. Instead, I want to think about, a doorway. So I'm going to use this sort of, I'm going to make a little house here. And I can't remember which. I think I used... make a pink house. I could make a gray house. I'm gonna use gray for the basic bricks of my house, like this, and then I'm gonna use these for like I could even put a little chimney up there and have a little smokestack coming out. This is a window. So if I wanted to do something like this, I would then take this and come here. Sorry, and extend this around. And now I got something that really does kind of resemble a house with just three different tile types. And I don't want this to be solid. I want to be able to like walk across it and stuff like that. But I want this to be a door and that could take me to somewhere else. And I could make it in an interesting way. I could make it so I walk here, I press the up, and then I check to see the collision. But for the sake of this tutorial, all I'm going to do is when I walk here, it's a warp type tile type. Because I want to spend the time showing you guys how to add multiple tile per screen, multiple warps. I'm sorry. So what I'm going to do is easily enough, I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to modify the attribute and make it a warp tile. And if I look at my collision, you can see that's a warp tile. I could do the same thing. I can make this a warp tile. It can be either of them a warp tile. So we're going to talk about what a warp tile is actually doing. So there's two things that we need to consider. If I warp out of this screen, what screen do I go to? And if I warp into this screen, where do I show up? The first one is warping out. If I hit screen info, I have warp out screen, and it's right here. Forget this one. In fact, we're never actually going to look at this. Don't look at warp in screen location. Don't even look at this. Disregard it. I won't use it. Don't look at this one. And what's going to happen is some of you guys are going to just be changing these numbers instead of these numbers. So just make sure you're changing the one at the, okay, warp out to screen X, comma, Y. So where do I want to warp out to? Well, that's very easy. I pick a screen and I look up here at my numbers for that screen. If I wanted to go here, I'm going 4, 4. If I wanted to go here, read that, I'm going to 9, 3. If I'm going to here, I'm going to 1, 8, etc. So if I wanted to go here, I'd be going to 3, 0. I probably wouldn't want to go there because I would just get to the edge of the screen to go there. So let's make an arbitrary screen that's going to be the interior of this house. I'm going to say this screen right here, it's 2, 6. So this is eventually going to be where I'm going to go. For right now, I'm not even going to have it the inside of the house. I'm just going to like put some ground here just so I can tell that I'm on a new screen. I could build like an interior with these bricks or something like that. Maybe that's what I should do. Yes, this is like an interior, and I'm going to make it so it's just, an interior or something like that. And the other thing that I've got to do is I've got to determine where I show up on this screen. And this is why I said I'm not even going to use screen info, I could put those digits right here, but that gets confusing. I'm going to right click right here and I'm going to put set warp in location. What that does is, you look at screen info, it set that for me. So those first numbers you can see are set. That's what that did. So now I'm going to show up right here. And maybe I'd want to put like some kind of doorway here so I would know what this was or something like that. I could probably do something like, I don't know, this is terrible, but okay, I know that that's like the doorway I came through now. It's a horrible graphic, but you get the idea. And I could make this look a lot more interesting right now. I'm just going to add collisions so I don't fall through the floor when I get here. Let's just add collisions around here. And I'm not going to set that place that I set my warp in to be a warp as well. This is a common mistake that I see not just in NESmaker or NES game development, but all kinds of game development. If I go to my overworld and I go here, if I want to use this as a door that I go in and out of, which would be common for something like this, the problem is if I make this the position where I reappear, guess what I'm colliding with? The warp. We already told the game that this warp is going to take me to this screen. And if this is a warp, when I show up and I'm standing on the warp, it's going to take me to this screen and it's going to catch me in this forever going back and forth warp between the two. So there's a lot of ways to handle this. One is that you could set a variable called like standing on warp, and you can only activate a warp if that's not true. And as soon as you're no longer colliding with a warp, then it goes to false, and then you can collide with a warp again or whatever. Maybe I said that wrong, but you get the idea. Like I can set some condition that I have to have completely left a warp tile and not be touching it all in order to activate that again. It's a little more complicated than I want to get into today, but as far as a concept of how it could be possible and how this is not a NESmaker limitation, it's just a simplicity of code thing for these basic modules. Usually, easier thing to do is just right click next to a warp tile and maybe two next to a warp tile and place set warp in location here. So if I come, I'm going to show up here and I'm not in danger of colliding with that warp anymore. Then I go to the other screen and maybe I'll make these warps too. I'll modify this, make it a warp, modify this and make it a warp. But again, instead of showing up right on there, I'm going to show up to next to it. So now I'm not actually colliding with that. Now in this screen, if I want to go back to here, this screen right here is 2, 0. So what I want to say is I want to warp out to 2, 0. And now this warp is going to take me to here. And I want this one to go to 2, 6. So this warp, I need to go to screen info, is going to take me to 2, 6. Notice if I did not set the screen, it would be set to 0, 0. That's the default, which means the warp would take me back to this first screen. If I don't set a warp in position, it's going to set me to the corner of the screen, which might, depending on the direction I'm moving, have all kinds of weird consequences because I still could have inertia moving to the left or up or down, and then all of a sudden it would transport me to the screen, and it's very confusing. So make sure you're setting your warp out to screen, and then on the screen you're setting the warp in location. So what's good is this already works. This is already built to work. So let's test this real quick. This is already set to work. This is easy. So I got my first screen. I come over here and get my candy and ignore that one. Come to the screen and I hit this. And I go in the warp and now I'm here and I go back. And cool. So now I've got a house that I can go into and I could jump. It's hard for me to jump over that, which is problematic. So I'd want to make some way that I can get past this house, or I would want to check to see if I'm pressing the up button on that tile type in order to activate the warp. We're not going to do that right now. But what we are going to do is I'm going to get away. One thing I can do is I could make this only like 1 block high, and I'm going to make a secondary warp. And this is where it's going to get interesting for those of you who are just getting started with ASM. We're going to look at how we can utilize these bytes for a screen right now and use these as a secondary warp. So I'm going to use this user-defined byte, which doesn't mean anything in my code. In fact, it's not even utilized in the code right now. I'm going to show you how to utilize it, how to change this, say what this kind of warp is, and how to use it to actually create a secondary warp location. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to design my screen in a way that I can get up over the top. So I'll do this sort of 2-door thing. This is not a well-designed screen by any stretch of the imagination. But right now, I just want to make sure. Oops! Oh no, I screwed up. Easy to fix. Okay. So I just want to create another warp right here, and maybe I'll put another window in here. Uh, and this is going to be a warp tile, but I'm not going to use a warp tile for this one. If I use a warp tile for this one, it'll take me to the same place. I'm going to need to get creative. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put an umbrella here. If I want to, I could jump over this one and get to this one, or I could jump over them both and keep going. Terrible screen design, like I said, but let's just go with this for a second. So I want this to take me to a totally different screen. Can't use warp because warp's always going to see this. Okay. What I'm going to use is I'm going to use this user screen byte 00. So let me figure out, I could use any of the screen bytes. If I go into my settings, I could go into, and forgive me while I look for this user screen byte. So go to screen bytes, user screen byte 00. I'm going to change this into secondary warp. And now if I close that, it doesn't actually do anything. That's just the name that's going to show up here. So I can now figure out, okay, where do I want to warp? What do I want to do? Okay. So I'm going to, excuse me. Oh, there we go. All right. So I'm going to use this as my secondary warp tile. I'm going to need a tile type that's going to observe the secondary warp tile. It's going to go to a certain screen, and the screen it's going to go to is not this screen. It's whatever I have in that secondary warp position. But in order to even utilize these user-defined bytes, I need to load them somewhere into my project. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to explain this in more detail than you need. I'm going to go to my script settings, and I'm going to scroll down, and you're going to see one called extra screen loads. And I cannot remember where it is, but there's one called extra screen loads. It's a screen load right here. And right now, this has things that exist that are extra for this module. What I might want to do is I might want to save this as and iterate and make this like extra screen load, arcade platform based custom. And that way, if I really screw this up, which I might, I can get back to the old version without screwing it up too much. So this does nothing jumps here. So everything I'm going to do, I'm going to put before there. And what I'm going to do is we have to talk a little bit about the data that's getting loaded for your collisions. So if you look at a screen, there's a certain amount of data that's being loaded for collisions, and all of these are bytes that are getting loaded. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At the end of that is the screen info that gets loaded. When you load the screen info, there's a bunch of arbitrary bytes that do all kinds of things, load in which tile set you're loading, which monster set you're loading, all kinds of stuff like that. And we are going to use some of the bytes that are in that extra space to write to these user screen bytes. Now, where these things get output, this is where you wouldn't know this, and you'd have to count it to find out, and it would be annoying. But I'm just going to tell you where they are. Where these exist in the output code, one is they start at 187 bytes past the collision data. So if you can imagine the collision data, there's 16 columns, 16 rows, but it's only using half of that. It's using nibbles for each byte for each collision point. Nibbles contain 4 bytes or 4 bits. 4 bits gives you 16 values. There's 16 different collision types you can. So to optimize a little bit, every 2 tiles is 1 byte. So anyway, that being said, you go through all that, all the other bytes that are used for various things, and position number 187 past the collision pointer. That's where this data gets loaded. So what we can do is the collision pointer is already loaded. The actual position of the collision pointer is loaded during the normal screen load script. So when we get to extra screen loads, it kind of already has the collision pointer, the pointer for collision pointer loaded in. So what I can do is I can say I'm going to load Y with just number symbol 187. Oh, sorry, 187. 187. And then I'm going to load collision pointer, comma, Y. and I'm going to store that into a variable called secondary warp, which I haven't set up yet. Okay. I'm going to save that, and I'm going to come over to my overflow RAM. I'm going to hit the add button. So I'm now adding a new RAM variable, and I'm going to come down to the very bottom. That's where I put it. It says not set, and I'm going to name it secondary warp. So now when my screen loads, it's going to take that value that's that far past the collision table, and it's going to put it into this variable called secondary warp, which now I can read to know where my second warp should go to. Okay. So now I need to create a tile type that does exactly what warp tile does, except instead of going to the warp outputs tile, it goes to the secondary warp tile. It reads this. So what I'll do is I'm going to go to my screen settings, and I'm going to go down to my tiles, and I'm going to duplicate my warp. So I'm going to edit this. Now I've got my warp to screen. I'm going to save as, and I'm going to call this one secondary. Does not matter what you call it, but I'm going to call it secondary warp. Hit save. And you can see what's happening right now. I'm warping to the screen, warp to screen. Well, when my screen gets loaded, that warp out, I wish I could do this without having to do this every time, but sorry, my warp out screen is this screen. It does the math on this to figure out what screen that relates to. All my screens are done in numbers. So if you imagine this in hex value, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Technically, this is 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, starts at 16. But these are way easier to think of in hex because hex is a base 16 number system, which means this goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F. Then it starts at 1, 0. 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7, 1, 8, 1, 9, 1 A, 1 B, 1 C, 1 D, 1 E, 1 F. 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, 5, 0, 6, 0, 6, 1, 6, 2. So the hex value 62 this screen. So with that in mind, I'm going to come back over here to my screen that I want to have a secondary warp in. And I'm going to say I want to go to screen number 62. Oops. I guess I have to increase it. I'm going to go to screen number 62. Well, let me use my number pad. Sorry. I'm going to increase this until I'm at 62. And I'm looking over here for the hex value. So you can see what's happening. 62. Okay, so 62 equals 98 in decimal. And if you went and counted all the screen, by the time you get to the screen we're looking at, you'd be at 98. So I'm going to hit OK. This is going to get loaded into that variable that I created. When I load my screen, this variable right here is going to be loaded on this screen with that number, which is hex value 62. So now back to my tile type. Sorry, I got to do this. Yours should probably be already open. I can't, like I said, for some reason, I cannot open my scripts at the bottom of my screen. But this is my secondary warp. Instead of warping to screen, I'm going to warp to whatever value is in secondary warp. And the only other thing that I've got to do is this is the exact same label that was used in my warp screen. So what I'm going to have to do is I like to just put a little plus sign here. And that means it's a local variable, which I could reuse. And I started doing this a lot more later in code as I learned more about ASM. So you see this sometimes in my ASM code, and sometimes you see labels without it. You'll now notice I do it almost all the time. I put this little plus sign in front of my labels, and that means it's only moving to the very next one. There could be more not player for warp tile labels in my code. It won't matter. This will just look for the next one. It won't even care if there's more of them. It won't get confused about there being multiples. So that's what the little plus sign does and why I use it. So it's going to look and see if I'm a player. If I'm not a player, it's not going to warp anything. If it is, it's going to do exactly the same as the warp to screen, except instead of warping to the one that's in my warp to screen variable, it's going to warp to the screen that's in my secondary warp variable. So let's put now one last thing I have to do. I have to say that my last tile type, if I go to my tile types, File type number 15. Come here. Sorry, I've got multiple things open here. Project labels. File type number 15 is called secondary warp. And then in my script settings, I need to go down to my tile type for that, which right now is blank. And I need to go into my arcade. Is that where it was? It was an arcade platformer? I don't think it was. I think it was just in my files. Right? Yeah. So where I had saved it was just in the tile scripts. And I could see there it is, secondary warp in game, tile scripts, secondary warp. Why was it there? Because I opened this warp tile, which was in game, tile scripts, and then I saved as into the same folder, game, tile scripts, secondary warp. All right. So let's see if that, and then I'll paint it here, or right click, modify attribute, secondary warp, modify attribute, secondary warp. This should now take me to, well, you know what I did? I set them both to the same screen. But let's just check that first. Let's see if this takes me to this screen for sure. They should both take me to that same screen now. So let's just make sure. And then I'll change what secondary warp does in a second. So if I come over here, paying attention today. Okay. So right now, if I come into here, it should take me to that screen, which I expect. If I come here, it should take me to that screen, which I expect, because they're both set to the same thing, right? They were both set to this screen. But now let's change this screen. Let's make my secondary warp go to 0, 1, 2, 3. Let's make it go to 0F. All right. So this screen I'm going to make look very different. I'm going to make it brown interior, fill up the whole space, and I'm going to have a moon shining in the room and white trees surrounding it. So we're just absolutely going to be able to tell. And I'm still going to put a right click, put them in the sky, set warp in location. I'm not even going to be able to leave this room. Maybe I went to an underworld or something. So I'm going to go back to my screen that I set those two warps in. And this one is going to go to the same place. This one is going to go right to where I told it to that screen down the bottom, down here. The new warp, the secondary warp, is going to go to screen 0F, which is the same as screen 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, A, B, C, D, E, F, 0F. So I come in here and I go to my screen info. I change this to 15. You can see it changes to, I had to click off of that field, but I changed it to 15. You can see it changes to 0F. Now, we should now have two different types of warp. I'll have a second main warp and a secondary warp. And then I'm going to show you one last thing, and I'll make for quite a day. So if I go in here, I'm in my secondary warp, and I never set up my collisions. So let me just make sure. Oops. Let me just make absolute sure. Hit the reset button. I want to jump over it and end up in my. Oh no, I didn't make that. Oh man, I'm not gonna be able to get over it. Okay, hold on. Let me go back. I didn't actually make that a trampoline. So let me make this a trampoline that way. And in order to save myself a little bit of time, I'm going to start my guy right here. So I'm going to actually place him on the screen so I don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. And this is just a temporary thing. I'll jump over it. Does this take me to the right place? It does. I come back over here. And now I've got two warps on my screen. So that was a really cool way to get two warps on my screen. And if I wanted to, I could maybe use this as a secondary position to know where I should show up if I warp back onto the screen. And then I'd have to read that variable when I'm loading my screen to know if I should warp into a certain position. That gets a little more complicated, but it's totally possible in the same way. And hopefully this will start to get your brain going. The last thing that I want to talk about is it's really easy to do the rest of these as well. If I went ahead and I created a whole bunch of variables, I could even call them user screen byte 0, user screen byte 1, user screen byte 2, user screen byte 3. So they're related, or I could give them names of the common things that I needed them to be. I could call them whatever I want. All I have to do in order to see those is I would go to Dun, dun, dun. I come over here to, where was that? Sorry. Extra screen loads. And they're all consecutive. So 187 is where they start. I could say I and Y, which is increasing the Y, load, collision pointer, comma Y, and store it into user screen byte 01. Now, that's not going to work right now because I never made a variable called user screen byte 01, but I could. Or I could call this whatever variable I need. I could call it whatever I want. But the idea is I could just increase this 8 times and get all of them. Or if that makes me uncomfortable, this does the same thing as loading Y with 188. And that's loaded 189, 190, 191, etc., all the way through those 8 bytes. So that's how I can make use of those user screen bytes in cool ways, and that's how I could set up a secondary warp pretty easily, if as long as you don't have to worry about it also coming back to the screen. Hopefully, that was a cool tutorial. Again, dipping a little bit deeper into the script, and most importantly, looking at how the scripts underneath interface with the UI on. I will see you tomorrow.